Hello and welcome to Offsiders. Well, it's a scenario Australian sports administrators have been dreading. A positive test, a postponed game and a season in jeopardy. But that's what the AFL is grappling with after Essendon's Connor McKenna tested positive to COVID-19. Today's game against Melbourne has been postponed indefinitely. Essendon players, coaches and staff are now in isolation. And what happens next is anybody's guess.
The AFL has taken the decision to postpone tomorrow's Essendon v Melbourne match. Essendon player Connor McKenna returned a low-grade irregularity yesterday. He was tested again this morning and we were informed this afternoon that the test came back as positive. At the moment, all players and football department staff at the club have been asked to isolate. The club will be closed and cleaned as per the health department requirements. This is a reminder that we're going to have to be on our toes at all times. We are not through this crisis.
We're definitely not through that crisis indeed. Waleed Ali, welcome to you. I mean, the big issue here is if Connor McKenna has passed it on. We probably won't know till midweek later this week because that's going to open up all sorts of scenarios that the AFL was hoping wouldn't happen. And
it's eminently possible because it's what we saw in the NBA, isn't it? I think you had a player walk on the court and then a few days later you suddenly had 14 players who were positive. But this is exactly why the protocols exist. It's why they're training in small groups in order to be able to shut down little elements of this. And so I suspect it now becomes a question of how widespread within Essendon this is and how many players would they be prepared to go to and still say to Essendon, you've got to go out and play. If they've got, say they're training in a group of 8 and let's say all of them got it, do they just have 8 outs and then you proceed? This game still has to be made up. We don't know exactly when that's going to be made up. This is the moment, I think, where that statement Gillon McLachlan made at the very start of the season, that this is a 153-game season, it's not a 17-round season, is really going to come to the fore, I think.
They've postponed, obviously, today's game till later in the season. It definitely won't play in this block. Roy Masters?
Well, I think it also depends on how many tests you do. If the AFL do 2 per week, it's mandatory for players to do it 24 hours before a game. The NRL do it on a needs basis. We saw what happened last week when a Canterbury player reported the fact that at his children's school, a player had, the teacher had tested positive. So it comes back down to that whole thing of, remember the illicit drug testing, the more tests you do, the more positives you get.
Yeah, Georgina Robinson joins us from Sydney this morning. Georgina, thanks for joining us. As Roy just touched on, we've seen it in the NRL just last week and now the AFL. Do you think we're going to be seeing more of this?
Oh, 100%. We'll be seeing more of it, particularly, I think, in the AFL, given the wider community context of, in Victoria, of a surge in infections and active cases. And obviously the Victorian government's acted very quickly to postpone any easing of the restrictions, and that will hopefully, you know, have a direct effect as well on the AFL. I think it's important to note that the AFL is now investigating Connor for, you know, a potential breach of the protocols. There's been a lot of speculation about his trip to Ireland recently. That was a number of weeks ago, and I noted Gillon McLachlan yesterday went to great pains to point out that he's been tested several times since. So there's a lot. I guess there's a lot to be clarified on the matter and on the story. But certainly it also gives another perspective on, you know, the West Coast Eagles' request to leave the hub on the Gold Coast. You know, whether or not you can mount that argument convincingly now when we've just had a positive test is certainly a moot point.
There's going to be a lot of scrutiny on Connor McKenna, particularly this week. Just for the background, the March 22 postponement, within days he got on a plane, he returned home to Ireland. He's been suffering severe homesickness. He's already gone home a couple of times in the last 6 months. He said this year will probably be his last. He returned in late May. He was quarantined at Crown Casino for 14 days, or Crown rather, where he was tested twice and came back negative. And he returned at the club on June 1, so he's been back for 3 weeks, where he tested 5 times negative. He trained with the whole team. It was the entire contact session on Friday morning, tested Friday afternoon, arrived at the club yesterday morning and was told that test was irregular, so he was sent away straight away to go and have another test, and that's when it did come back positive. You just wonder what the scrutiny will be like now on all the players in the AFL, given that this has happened.
Well, and they've just eased some of the restrictions on the players. We know in the case of Victoria what the medical experts are concerned about is family-to-family transmission. So it's when families gather in houses. That's actually when the virus seems to be spreading at the moment, because social distancing doesn't really get observed, all of those sorts of things. And that's exactly the thing that has been relaxed in the case of the restrictions on AFL players. They're now more able to have family there. So all of this happens. The NRL, meanwhile, is releasing its players into the community at this stage. They're returning clubs to their home ground so that they can start playing. So, I think we're in this situation now where the very things that have allowed the codes to get back on are now being loosened at a time where you're starting to see a spike in Victoria particularly. And so it's going to be on. I think we're panicking a bit because we knew this was a possibility and now it's arrived. Surely this is exactly what bodies like the AFL and, by extension, the NRL were planning for, and that's why they'll have the protocols set up that they do. So
what are the protocols, Roy, then? Because he lives in a city apartment. He shares that with his brother and his brother's girlfriend. All three are quarantining now at the moment. But all the Essendon players and staff will be tested probably Tuesday. We'll know Tuesday night how many will come back positive. If it's 5, if it's 10, they still will be forced to field. The negative ones are free to then return to training and play. They're due to play Carlton next Saturday night. If it's half of them, I mean, do you cast them adrift? Do you say that's it?
Well, you've got to maintain the integrity of the competition. You cannot expect half a club to perform. Particularly Essendon, whom you'd almost have to say has become a cursed club as a result of all the maladies that have come their way. Look, overlaying this whole thing too is the mystery about this highly contagious disease. The doctors themselves still don't know the circumstances around how it can be transmitted so quickly in some cases, such as on cruise ships, but remotely in others.
And it just seems coincidental, I'm just putting it out there, that he's the only player of 800 AFL players that went overseas during that 12-week lockdown, went to Ireland. He's come from a hotbed where the coronavirus was sort of everywhere, and But
it's got to be, I mean, if it's got anything to do with that, then he becomes medically very interesting, because it's been a long time. Right?
We're clearly not medical experts to dig down there.
But it's like a dark intruder hiding behind a door, and then suddenly it jumps out and grabs you, and you don't know why you were so unlucky to be grabbed.
I take Roy's point about the integrity. Oh, sorry, Georgina, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think in terms of the codes and the bargains they've made, I think the context of it is that these football codes professionally have been just hell-bent on getting their comps up and running in order for the broadcast revenue deals to be re-engaged and for the money to start flowing in. So to do that, they've accepted a degree of grey, and they're operating in that grey. And we've seen 3 different codes, or 2 different codes at least, and rugby union has delayed their comp even longer and is now about 2 weeks, just under 2 weeks off kick-off. We've seen them handle things differently, and they've also intentionally, from the very start, refused to lay out black and white sort of protocols on what would happen if there was a test. You know, the NRL postponed a game for just over 24 hours on the basis of a player's child attending a school with a positive test, and now we've seen what's happened when a player has actually had a positive test. I don't think there's any certainty over how the codes will continue to deal with it, but I think, you know, in terms of the circumstances in society allowing them to get the games back on, they've pushed very hard, not knowing exactly, you know, what kind of bargain they were striking, and that at any moment it all might come a cropper, but they've been really dependent on that money coming back in.
Well, it could come a cropper if there are multiple tests that we find out midweek. This is the AFL CEO, Gillon McLachlan, on that possibility.
I think in the end, if there's multiple players down, it's a challenge for Essendon. But the way we've been, we now know exactly when. We know every player was negative on Wednesday's test. We know every player is negative by 1 today, and I think that gives us a lot of comfort. That's why the protocols were set up.
It's a challenge for Essendon. Might not be the first time that we've seen Essendon struggle to field a team in the competition.
No, well, that I think is the key point that answers Roy's point. You can talk about competition integrity all you like. This is a season where that's compromised. There is simply no way around that fact. The fact that you've got teams in hubs and other teams not. You've got a shortened game that's not at all what the team's trained for leading up to the pre-season. This is a premiership that was probably won in April, depending on how teams handled the lockdown situation. There are all kinds of irregularities in this, and I cannot imagine a scenario where the AFL tries to prioritise that integrity question because Essendon are missing a few players over getting the season done. What they have done, though, is they've given themselves time.
Will the West Coast Eagles be there for the whole season? I mean, that's the other problem they've got. They've got Essendon and they've got, well, not the West Coast Eagles, the WA government, which is refusing to drop its borders.
And Adelaide might be the same, by the way, because the South Australian government just said if this Victoria situation continues, our borders may not be open to Victoria.
So the West Coast Eagles, one of the premiership favourites, they've lost both their games so far in that hub on the Gold Coast, went down by 30 points to the Brisbane Lions last night. They've got 2 more games to play there, but they're not happy. And they're not happy for 2 reasons. They're not happy because they don't want to stay longer. Initially, behind the scenes, their CEO, Trevor Nisbet, was told, he says, 4 weeks, 4 games, that's it, then you come back. And the other reason they're not happy is that they would have to, they've been told that they would have to quarantine in a Perth hotel for 14 days. They want to be able to quarantine at home and continue on with training. Do the West Coast Eagles have a point here?
They have a point, but they have no argument because their argument is with the West Australian government. It's not with the AFL. So they can make all these complaints and they can be as well thought through as they are. That's all fine. And the AFL can say, we'll do our very best. But unless the AFL somehow wins an election in WA and starts rewriting the laws and the protocols that are in place in that state, there is simply nothing they can do about it other than introduce a bye of some sort, bring some teams into WA that quarantine for a couple of weeks, have another mini hub in WA. They might end up doing something like that, but that's not a sustainable thing over a long period of time, unless you're going to say the WA teams just stay in Perth all year. This is out of the control of sports administrators.
What about how the way, Roy, I'm interested in your take on their coach, Adam Simpson, and how he's handled it. Let's have a listen to him because he's walking a fine line, isn't he? He's spoken publicly about it. Is he trying publicly to protect and fight for his club and what's right? But at the same time, he's giving his players a reason to lose and play poorly. This was Adam Simpson on Friday afternoon.
If we can't quarantine in our own houses when we get back and stay in a hotel for another 2 weeks, we need to get home after Richmond. So that's our position and we're pretty strong on that. But we've got to look after our staff and our players, and it's probably a bridge too far. So there needs to be a line in the sand at some stage.
Look, he's supporting his club, but at the same time he's throwing a lot of negativity into his players. As Waleed said earlier, this is a whole season has been compromised in so many different ways, as it has in the NRL, where they brought in rules right on the eve of the resumed competition. For a coach in the NRL to complain about the fact, oh, we didn't know about this 6 again, is the same as this guy giving some negativity to his players, some excuse. Their performance, he's got to be strong and stand up and accept the circumstances as they are.
Georgina, I mean, he was rather conciliatory last night when he held his post-match media conference coming off that loss, but how do you read it?
Oh, I have enormous sympathy for all the players and staff, you know, at West Coast and any other team that's on the hub, and anyone broadly who hasn't had some kind of physical or emotional reaction to these extraordinary past few months is, I don't know, you'd have to question their humanity, but I just think at the end of the day, this is the cost of getting paid. This is the deal that the codes have signed up for. They want their games back on TV. They want the bank account starting to fill again with money from broadcasters and sponsors and other commercial partners, and this is what has to happen. You know, I'd also note that in other codes all around the world and sports, players spend months and months on the road. Cricket tours, rugby tours, you know, footballers who spend their entire careers away from home earning money for their families. I'm not immune to the hardship that the players and staff are going through, but I think at the end of the day, this is the price. This is the price the code has agreed to pay, and them as signatories to their contracts have agreed to pay.
I just wonder with the internationals though, I mean, they sign up for that, whereas the AFL players in there, they didn't sign up for this, but then I guess no one signed up for what's happening this year.
the most common expression you hear amongst footballers and coaches today and administrators is, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And so they've got to accept, everybody, that it is what
where the
it
rubber
is.
hits the road on that little cliche. It is what it is. Deal with it.
The WA government expected to announce in the next 24, 48 hours the latest on its borders, and also whether it will allow the West Coast Eagles and the Fremantle players to quarantine at home or not. I just feel there might be a bit of give and take. Stay a couple of weeks longer in the hub and then you'll be able to go home. So we'll find that out. And the AFL to announce their fixture was meant to be the next block, which would have been the next 3 or 4 rounds. Just the next round, round 6, because of the difficulties that will be in the next couple of days.